Harvard Divinity School.
100 Years Rudolf Steiner, December 15th and 16th, 2025.
Our first is Peter Lutzker. He has taught English and music at Waldorf schools in Frankfurt and Dusseldorf, and in 2010 became a professor at the Free University of Stuttgart's Waldorf Teacher College, and he also teaches at the National Tsinghua University in Taiwan, where he was appointed honorary professor in 2019. So please welcome Peter for his presentation.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me here. One of the remarkable things about Waldorf teacher education is the demands it makes on a teacher's self-development. The concept underlying Waldorf teacher education is that the self-development of the teacher is what helps enable pupils to develop their own selves. Because obviously you can only develop yourself. No one can develop you for you. But the idea in Waldorf teacher education is that the self-developing teacher creates a space, creates an environment, creates an atmosphere that best enables pupils to make their own developments and their own steps in learning. And in this talk, I want to talk about what self-development for teachers actually means. And I'm going to concentrate on two different streams that come together, sort of a confluence of two rivers. And this one stream is the artistic stream. The other stream is the spiritual meditative stream. And how they both, in the end, these two rivers flow into the practical elements of Waldorf education. And that's what those quotations indicate. From the very beginning of Waldorf teacher education, Steiner focused on the teacher's development in the very first teacher's course. You know, he had 2 weeks to prepare these group of people, many of whom were not teachers, to prepare them for teaching at the first school. And the kinds of work that he did with them, for instance, in speech, in poetry, and dramatic elements, was not designed for poems and speech that they would do in school. It was designed for their own development. And the reason is, I think, that he had the concept of teaching as an art and the teacher as an artist. And for the teacher to become an artist, it not only requires the methodology, which can be artistic, but also requires the teacher, him or herself, becoming artistic. And that's the kind of work he was doing in the very first teacher's course. And in Waldorf teacher education, this is something that plays a crucial role. And I'd like to start, before we look at the meditative spiritual side, I'd like to talk about the artistic side and what that can actually mean. What does it mean to help teachers, either teachers who are already teachers or teachers who want to become teachers? How can we help them develop their own artistic potentials that will then enable them to teach artistically? And Steiner didn't mean only artistically in artistic subjects, he meant artistically in all subjects. And I don't want this to become too abstract. So I'd like to actually give you a concrete example of artistic education, artistic teacher education, which I experienced. In Waldorf teacher education, we sometimes have the chance to work with some extraordinary actors, directors, storytellers, theater clowns, people who are not only highly developed professionals in their art, but are also wonderful teachers. And working with them is a chance for us as teachers to go past certain habits of speaking, habits of behaving, habits of being on the stage in the classroom in ways that reflect our habits and our background, but not necessarily ideal to create the environment for which pupils can best learn. And for instance, to learn to speak a poem in such a way that it really becomes, the poem speaks through the teacher and not just the teacher speaking the poem, is an art. And we try to work with professional storytellers, actors, directors, who can, that's their art, who can help us do that. And the Waldorf English Week, which a group of us, including Martin, who will be speaking after me, founded 28 years ago, has an intensive week of working where the focus of that week, we're teaching English as a foreign language teachers. Those are the teachers who come from all over the world. We have 130, 140 teachers from all over the world who all teach English in their different countries. It's a week of where they're hearing lectures, they're doing methodology courses too. But the heart of the week is these intensive 3-hour daily courses working with professional actors, directors, storytellers, who are helping them discover and work on their own artistic development. And I've taken all these courses, the courses offered by these different people. Even as one of the organizers, it's of course a wonderful opportunity to take those courses. And I found them incredibly challenging and incredibly transformative. You know, that you really become someone different at the end of that week. And I'd like to tell you about not something that I personally experienced directly, but something that I experienced that somebody else went through, because it stuck in me and I learned a lot from that experience. On the last day of the conference, we always have in small groups sort of a review of the week. And one year, there was a review of the week. We're sitting in a small, 6, 7 people, and everybody saying what the week meant to them. And one woman started to talk, and she was saying how incredibly beautiful this work was with Robert McNear, one of the actors and directors who does one of these courses. And she got so emotional in telling us how important it was. She started to cry. And nobody quite knew what to do. And she just was crying. She was so moved by what she had just experienced. And so we just moved on in the circle. And afterwards, I go to Robert and say, what happened in your group? Because there's a woman crying in the group at the end of the lesson, at the end of our group meeting. And he then told me what happened. See, part of the work in his group is everybody's asked to prepare a poem that's important to them, a poem maybe they learn by heart, that they speak. The group in a circle is around them. And then Robert works with them. And the work with him is not designed that they interpret the poem the way he would interpret the poem. The work is always designed, how can that poem speak through this person, to who this person is and their relation to that poem. It's very intensive work, and it's always wonderful to see how a poem begins to speak through a person. And you sometimes have these class teachers who start with the poem, it's big, it's loud. In the course of the work with him, 10, 15, 20 minutes, it gets much simpler, much more beautiful, just because it's no longer the person believing this is the way to speak a poem, but it's the way the poem actually itself can speak through him when he lets go of that concept of how a poem should be spoken. And he describes that this woman was very, very shy, very, very nervous, and the whole week long didn't offer to do that in the circle. Everybody's supposed to bring their poem, and she waited to the very last day, and he realized the whole time she's very shy. At the same time, in the course of that week, there's a trust built in the group. You have the experiences, and one begins to trust that working with him will bring something good. And so the last day, she finally had the courage to do that. And so she does this, and the poem she had learned was "The Lake Isle of Innisfree" by Yeats. And Robert told me the first time she spoke it was very clear just how nervous she was, and people in the circle looking at her, and she really was very nervous. At the same time, he realized that the poem really meant a lot to her. And so he asked everybody to turn away from her so that she just saw their backs. So they were the only person, nobody saw her, and she didn't see anyone else. So just the two of them could work together. He said they work together 10, 15 minutes, and Robert works, he works physically with the people, he works with their imagination, he works in lots of different ways, always very individual. And then at the end, she spoke the poem, what she thought was the last time, and it was much, much better. It was much freer, and everybody clapped. Everybody thought, great. And she thought she was done. She was very relieved. And then he said, no. He said he wants her to speak it one more time. And then she said, would everybody please turn around now so that we can see each other? And she says, and he said, and he told me this, he didn't tell her this. He said he had noticed that every time she said the word I, she withdrew into herself. And the Lake Isle of Innisfree, I starts, there's 3 stanzas of 4 lines, and I starts each stanza. The first stanza, I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree. Second stanza, and I shall have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow. And then the last stanza has each line starts with an I. I will arise and go now, for always night and day I hear lake water lapping with low sounds by the shore. While I stand on the roadway or on the pavement's gray, I hear it in the deep heart's core. And he said each time she said I, she went to herself. He asked her, every time that the I comes up in the poem, before you say it, look at the people's faces, look into the circle. And he said she did this, and it was so powerful how that changed her and the kind of loving looks she got from people. That is that at the end of it, not only did she cry, but everybody else in the group cried as well. And trying to figure out, when he told me this, I thought, what happened here actually? You know, what spoke through her? What experience did she have that was that powerful, that an experience that needed a teacher, it needed the group, and it needed her, of course, to make those steps. And Steiner talks about how poetry and music, through poetry and music, we can experience a second being, a higher self, a spirit self in ourself. He says this in different ways, but it's always, there's something in ourself that lives, there's something higher than our everyday ordinary self. He says poetry and music can help us experience that, can connect us to that, connect us to what he says are the spiritual heights, connect us. The spirit self is a microcosm of the spirit that lives connecting us to the macrocosmos of the spiritual world. And I have the feeling, without knowing this, that something like that happened to her, and she experienced this, and she needed the group, and she needed the teacher, and she needed the poem. And Steiner says in one point, he says, by its very nature, art can become permeated with the light of the spirit, and when this has happened, it retains this light. Then wherever art radiates, it permeates whatever it touches. With the light of soul, it can express spirit. And this is what we hope for when we're working with the arts and teacher education. This is what we're trying to achieve. Of course, it doesn't always happen. It's not a given. There's no certainty involved. But in the arts and teacher education, it's a chance that through the arts, this can become experienced. And I'd like to read to you, as a final thought on the artistic stream, something that someone wrote with the same last name as Rudolf Steiner. His name is George Steiner, one of the great literary critics of the 20th and 21st century, who was also a professor here. So I'm really glad to bring him in. He said, "It is, I believe, poetry, art, and music which relate us most directly to that in being which is not ours. The arts are most wonderfully rooted in substance, in the human body, in stone, in pigment, in the twanging of gut or the weight of wind on reeds. All good art and literature begin in immanence, but they do not stop there, which is to say very plainly that is the enterprise and privilege of the aesthetic to quicken into lit presence the continuum between temporality and eternity, between matter and spirit, between man and the other. The aesthetic is the making formal of epiphany. There is a shining through." So the artistic stream and the spiritual meditative stream have a lot in common and share a lot in common, but they're two very different forms of practice. And I'd like to talk about the practice of meditation and teacher education, because that's the other river flowing into the practical work of education. In Germany, speaking about meditation in Waldorf context and Waldorf teacher education has often been a controversial theme. And the caution is based on the understandable idea that meditation is the freest possible act we can do. That's what Rudolf Steiner called it. It's our freest act. And so in teacher education, we require people to take courses. I think you can require someone to take a course in eurythmy or a course in speech or a course in sculpting. These are all courses that can be requirements, but you can't require a course in meditation. You can't require someone to meditate. And so I know for a long time where I taught in Stuttgart, this was not a theme that was really talked about. It was a thing that was totally left up to students to find their own way. And then about 10 years ago, I had a student who has part of his thesis did a qualitative study interviewing and with questionnaires, whether other students wanted to have meditation taught, and if so, should it be more explicit? Should it just open questions? How did they imagine meditation could be part of teacher education? And the results of that thesis and his work were that an overwhelming majority wanted it to be taught explicitly, and missed it being there as part of our teaching courses. And so at that point, in the courses in self-education, which was the course I had taught, but meditation hadn't played a primary role, I began to integrate that into those courses. And I did it on hand a book by Arthur Zajonc that I found extremely helpful and almost a paradigmatic example of how to teach meditation. I'm sure many of you know the book, Meditation as a Practice of Contemplative Inquiry When Knowing Becomes Love. I think it's such a wonderful book in teacher education because Arthur's own path was anthroposophical. And there are a number of exercises and thoughts of Steiner in this book, but there's also Buddhist exercises, Buddhist thought, there's also Christian thought, there's also Jewish thought. It becomes a wonderful pluralistic approach to different meditative practices. And this was, I thought, exactly what anthroposophy now needs if you're going to talk about meditation. And so part of Arthur's book is also designed to talk about why to meditate. And this is something, of course, deeply based in his own anthroposophical approach. And what he makes clear is that in the meantime, lots of people meditate for all sorts of reasons. And there's nothing, obviously, that's their choices. But his understanding of meditation is not that we do it, football teams, soccer teams meditate, they practice their focusing. And it gets lots of examples. He says, we actually meditate from an anthroposophical perspective and from other perspectives we heard today about the Buddhist perspective. We do it for the others. That's why we meditate. We do it for the others. And I think we can connect that also to the fact that Rudolf Steiner, one of the reasons he left the Theosophical Society, there were different reasons, but one of them is the idea that the Theosophical Society thought you could separate the way you lived your life and your spiritual development. And we know in How to Achieve Knowledge in a Higher World, Steiner talks about 3 steps in moral development. And by moral, he means the way we are towards others for 1 step in spiritual development. And so science books makes this very clear. And I think John Davies said this very beautifully and very succinctly when he says, a living understanding of the practice of anthroposophy is not quoting the last Steiner book that you read, but the next person you meet. And so I think that there's really a chance here to have meditation for teachers. And we know there's teachers' meditations, but there's countless meditations as something that they can realize it becomes something that can become very much a part of who they are as teachers. And I think Rabindranath Tagore said something very similar when he said, I slept and dreamt that life was joy. I awoke and saw that life was service. I acted, and behold, service was joy. So we had today Liz's wonderful lecture where she also talked about the big problems that we have now with finding teachers. Nobody wants to be a teacher anymore, and there's lots of different reasons for that. And we realize just how difficult it is for those people who are teaching to be teaching a generation of children who, as Liz pointed out, are bringing all sorts of difficulties and challenges with them. And I think the one thing that we most need to be able to face those challenges is hope. Because if we don't have any hope as teachers, then we don't have any reason to be a teacher. And to understand how hope can be really the fundament of what we do, I'd like to end with a quotation by Václav Havel, who I think talks about hope in the most profound way that I know of. And it's the kind of hope that I think that we as teachers need to have, because sometimes with teachers, we look at our challenges and we think, how can we possibly hope? Havel, I assume most of you know, but just to make clear, it's also a wonderful example of how the artistic and the spiritual come together and become very practical. Havel was a famous Czech playwright and writer who in the communist times was constantly put into jail for fighting for freedom of expression and against the oppression of the communist government. And while in jail, he wrote a letter to a friend. Either we have hope within us or we don't. It is a dimension of the soul. It is an orientation of the spirit, an orientation of the heart. It transcends the world that is immediately experienced and is anchored somewhere beyond its horizons. Hope in this deep and powerful sense is not the same as joy that things are going well, but rather an ability to work for something because it is good, not just because it stands a chance to succeed. The more unlikely the situation in which we demonstrate hope, the deeper that hope is. Hope is definitely not the same thing as optimism. It's not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out. In short, I think that the deepest and most important form of hope, the only one that can keep us above water and urge us to good works, and the only true source of the breathtaking dimension of the human spirit, is something we get, as it were, from elsewhere. Is also this hope above all, which gives us the strength to live and continually to try new things, even in conditions that seem as hopeless as ours do here and now. He was in jail at that point, 1985. 1989, he was also in jail. At the beginning of 1989, what happened in the autumn of 1989 is, most of you know, the mass demonstrations against the communist regime, the so-called Velvet Revolution. The end of November, the peaceful overthrow of the communist regime. In December 1989, Václav Havel was elected by the Czech parliament to become the president of Czechoslovakia. And this is a story that I used to tell my high school students. I like to tell my teaching students, because it's an example of the dignity, the purity of hope, and what it can give you for strength. And that hope comes, on the one hand, a life lived in artistic experience, a life lived in an attempt for freedom, and a life lived with the conviction that the hope and the strength come from elsewhere. And in the end, this leads to the most remarkable things. And I think it's these kind of stories, which are obviously true stories, that I think teachers today need more than ever. Thank you.
Sponsored by the Program for the Evolution of Spirituality.
Copyright 2023, the Preston Fellows of Harvard College.